began as a way to improve information and communication flow, but there's been a lot of talk lately about what's next. So today we talk about the future of some of the technologies that make up the web with two of my friends. Hello, I'm your host, Ray Villalobos. I'm the Senior Staff Instructor at LinkedIn Learning, and I'm here today with Simon St. Laurent, Senior Content Manager for LinkedIn Learning, as well as Morten Rand Hendrickson, who is also a Senior Staff Instructor at LinkedIn Learning. How is it going?
Good.
Morten was making me laugh so hard before the show by doing a dance to the music that you guys didn't see. And this is where I wish
the dance performance.
this is where I wish I could capture things that you guys don't see. So anyways, before we get started, let's take care of some things. First is this is the last of a 5-part series that we've been doing this week on the future of code. We're talking to industry experts from all walks of tech. And we started day one by talking about databases. And then on Tuesday, we covered legacy languages like Java. And then we moved on to Wednesday, where we talked about machine learning language and data science with a couple of my other friends. And we moved on to yesterday's show, where we talked to Adelina Simeon and Marcus Willock about the future of languages like Go and Rust, which are emerging languages. And I'm finally, right now, in a comfortable place, I feel like, for something that I feel qualified to talk about, which is the web, with two of my friends, as I mentioned. So I am so happy to have reached this particular moment. And this should be great because, whereas I've known some of the people that I've had the privilege to interview today, I'm really just talking to a couple of friends who are very, very funny. I know they probably seem like they're very serious most of the time, but they're hilarious. We're also taking questions from the audience, which we'll get to later in the show. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll get to those a little bit later. So to make this interactive, I started out with a poll, and you can check that out by going to whenever you see a red box, it means that's a link that you can go to and check out. So the question of the day today is, which one of these web technologies would you be the most shocked to find out made it in 10 years? Go ahead and add yours in the comment. And I'm going to start by asking you guys, what do you guys think? What would you be surprised out of like these different web technologies to see in like 10 years, Morten?
Did you ever actually sound out that URL for yourself, Ray?
Raybo.r/FOC poll Friday. Sounds.
Fuck poll free.
Listen, I work with what I can. Yes,
that's what it says. Okay,
I say FOC, but if you want to go there. All right, back to the show. Let's see. So, what would you be surprised that would still be around in 10 years? So, Web 3, 4, 5, who knows? Quick is like this brand new framework that just got a lot of fire, I guess, in the industry. TurboPack is like the successor to Webpack, a brand new build tool, and Asterisk, like probably next to Quick, like the hottest sort of framework. Where it's really a meta framework, a framework that takes any framework and lets you build sites. And then we have other things too. What do you think?
So
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Simon.
Go Simon first.
Okay. I mean, frameworks come and go. They can zoom through like a comet, and sometimes that's all they last for. So it's possible that any of those frameworks will either vanish or change its name or be absorbed by something else or take over the world. It kind of depends. The Web 3.4.5 thing is a somewhat more complicated question because I think the current iteration of Web3 is having a very bad month, probably a very bad year. But when you have 3, 4, 5 there, people might come up with, what Web 4 is and what Web 5 is. And we don't know yet. And in 10 years, that will be the standard. So who knows?
Yeah. What about you, Morten? What do you think?
10 years is a very long time in technology space. I mean, Pinterest launched 10 years ago.
Wow.
People were still using BlackBerries 10 years ago. Right?
That's a good point.
The toolkits that we use today, I think that nothing of my toolkit that I use today to develop things, except for the core languages, is in use anymore.
Hmm.
right? All the things I use, Post CSS didn't exist 10 years ago. Webpack didn't exist 10 years ago. NPM didn't exist 10 years ago. Like none of the things that we use today existed 10 years ago. So on that list, I would say the web will persist. The numbering scheme has been destroyed by the Web3 people and will be abandoned after that all implodes completely, which was happening right now. So we will just have the web. In some iteration, it'll probably be some sort of weird 3D AR weirdness that looks nothing is unimaginable to us right now and that we wouldn't recognize as the web today. And these other things, like some iteration of these things will exist. We will still have build tools. We will still have other build tools. I mean, there are 3 build tools, so or
Hmm.
tool stacks. So we will have something like that, but I doubt that there will be anything like what we have today. They'll be AI powered. We'll be yelling at computers because they're not optimizing things as optimizationally as we want them to, and they'll be yelling back at us. So I
That's
think I'd be
interesting.
shocked if any of those things exist 10 years from now. I mean, I'd be
That
shocked
is
if.
true. That's true. I was talking to you about this. We got to go to GitHub Universe, and I remember talking to you about how when I was writing this course on the history of full stack development, while I was writing it, Next.js launched version 13. This new framework called Quick came out, or just really started making a buzz in the market, I guess. TurboPack came out. Remix was a car by Shopify, all within the span of that 1 week where I was actually recording the course. And if you go back a little bit more while I was writing the course. And I felt like this is just crazy. Is it always going to be like this? Do you feel like the web is always going to have this relentlessly fast-paced like innovation curve, or is it going to stop at some point?
I think the relentlessness of it that's happening right now is, well, there are 2 parts to it. So one is the business aspect. The business aspect won't change, right? Because business is business and commerce is commerce, and people will keep eating each other's companies and try to stay on top of the pile. Um, the development stack, I think what we're seeing now is that it's maturing, um, where in the development of the core languages, especially JavaScript and CSS, we're seeing a significant maturing of how it's done, right? So the people that are making decisions are doing it in far more structured way. We have Interop 2022 that is getting all the web browser companies to work together on common goals instead of fighting each other. So we're seeing this rapid increase in capabilities on the web platform, but that also means that after we've kind of implemented all the things that we've been wanting for the past 20 years, there will be a slowdown where we're not going to implement a bunch of new stuff because we'll hit a point where it's like we have the tools we need for now. And there might be new branches that will emerge that go into new territory we haven't explored before, like AR, like whatever comes after AR. And that will continue evolving. But I don't see this, you need to learn a new tool every single week thing happening, because eventually we'll kind of consolidate towards tools that just work really well and tool stacks that work really well. And things will start breaking into more platformy kind of behavior, right? I do anticipate that in the very near future, we'll move towards a space where less hand coding is happening and more AI coding is happening. And at that point, a lot of this, what tool are you using will be handed off to an AI. So it'll be more a question of what AI are you using, and then that AI will choose whatever build tool is necessary to get the work done.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think about this, Simon, as well, because I believe we have seen a little bit of this already happening. Like, if you think about, say, like blogging platforms, there's not a lot of new blogging platforms coming out. There's not a lot of like new, just maybe web developments. I mean, we've got things like no code and low code, like Wix, that help people just build a website pretty easily. So, where there's not like a huge discussion of, hey, building websites. I think a lot of the frameworks are trying to build more applications. So what are your thoughts on this?
So on the blogging side, I kind of think social media obliterated a lot of the blogging story and made it less crucial to people trying to get their message out. With Twitter's apparent meltdown right now, I think we may see actually a revival in people wanting to take control of their own platforms for these kinds of things. So I'm kind of hoping that conversation gets started again, but we'll see what happens.
Hmm.
Um, on the broader tools front, I remember life before frameworks and libraries. Um, and then they appeared, and there was this huge burst of different contending frameworks and libraries,
Hmm.
Dojo and Backbone, and then Angular JS and React. And there was a while when it just seemed like everything kept moving. Um, right now, I feel like the world has kind of settled on React as a sensible default for frameworks. Um, and I was worried that was going to kind of stall out all the experiments and all the new ideas. But thankfully, it hasn't happened that way. At the moment, we seem to be in a place where, yes, React is dominant for like corporate development and a lot of related things. But people are using that stability, the fact that we're in a time where you don't have to scramble for every framework detail, to explore with new things on the side. We are still seeing new frameworks pop up regularly. We're definitely seeing new build tools happen, I don't know,
Hmm.
weekly. Um, I think as soon as one thing stabilizes, people still have that energy and they put it towards something else.
Wow. Yeah. So we sort of touched on this briefly, Morton, about this Web3, Web5, like what's the web going to be like? Can you define, you've done some content on this, I know. So can you define what those approaches are? Is this thing that's happening with Twitter where people are maybe trying to own their own, I don't know, platform? Is that part of it? Like what's happening there?
So there's intentional term confusion here. There's this thing that people refer to as Web3, where there's no space and no dot and no point oh. That is a marketing term for blockchain and crypto technology. It has nothing to do with the web. They have simply realized that, hey, if we attach the word web to it, and say that this is the next iteration or next version or next phase of the web, then a bunch of web people will be like, oh, cool, we need to pour money into it. It has nothing to do with the web. It's a very confused thing about crypto, and it's, just watch what is happening in the crypto world right now. Like, imagine if we
Mm,
had a web built on that technology, it would be a disaster. But if we, instead of looking at the thing people call Web3 as a viable future for the web, which it's not, if we instead look at it as a critique of the current existing models for how we handle content, how we handle privacy, how we handle online finances and stuff like that, it is a valid critique. It's just an invalid solution. And one of the major things that the Web3 community is highlighting is that we live in a world right now where there is no such thing as content ownership on the web. And it's kind of interesting because we all had blogs at some point. I still have a blog. I don't know if you guys do, but I still have a blog. Um, and we used to own our own content, and that used to be like the pride of being on the web, that you owned your own content. And then all these platforms came along that made it much easier to publish content online, and it lowered the barrier for publishing content online down to install an app, sign in, and then you're good to go, right? And as a result, almost all the content we publish today is consolidated under these monolith platforms: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, right? And so when you're talking about like, where did blogging go? That's where blogging went. It went into these major platforms. And we now are seeing, thanks to Elon Musk, that putting all our eggs in one platform basket is really risky because some person can suddenly buy the entire basket and do whatever he wants with it. So there is this, I see this move back towards, hey, we actually need to own our own content. And we need to be wary of surveillance capitalists and what they're doing to our data. The challenge we're having is that we, the web people, the web community, spent the past 10 years onboarding everyone onto the surveillance capitalist platforms. We deliberately abandoned our own tools and went, hey, go use this instead because that's where the money is. So we haven't built viable alternatives, right? So that's why I always say that people keep saying, delete Facebook. It's an incredibly elitist way of thinking about things because in many parts of the world, Facebook is the internet. This is the only thing people can use. It's the only tool people have to access information and to interact with their governments and interact with their families and so on. And when you say delete Facebook, you have to then say, and go here. There is no here. We haven't built here. So we need to get together as a community. And when I mean community, I don't mean web developers. I mean the world as a community, and say, what do we want out of this thing called the internet? And how do we build solutions on the internet that are viable, that are not just capital machines for large corporations, but are actually useful so people can be and do what they have reason to value in the world?
That's super interesting, Morton. Simon, you are not just a content manager, but you're a legit developer, having written a ton of books. And one of the things that I appreciate about you is just your deep knowledge of programming topics. What sort of trends are you seeing in development? I think we've talked about a couple of them already, but I'd love to get your sort of technical sort of background of what you see as a content manager that that the market is going towards.
Well, part of the fun of working on web topics is that the web is where all of these pieces come together. All of the topics you've covered this week for the future of code are things that are relevant to the web. Um, Everybody has their favorite language, their favorite technique, their preferred way of working. I feel like we saw the the server side remains really diverse. The client side is almost always JavaScript, CSS, HTML. Sometimes TypeScript sneaks in there. We're starting to see a little bit of WebAssembly get in
Hmm.
there, so you don't have to use those tools. But it hasn't really happened yet, which kind of surprises me given the intense frustration I know a lot of people have with front end web tools. Um, Most of what I'm seeing is it's actually just been a calmer period lately. I don't mean it's
Hmm.
like becalmed, like the ship isn't moving. I mean like people are doing work without changing as much as rapidly as they used to. I kind of remember like the Rails explosion when it first came out. And I kind of marvel that Twitter was first built on Rails. And thankfully, I don't think it is anymore. But people did everything, they tried new things. I see some similar changes on the server side with people being excited about Go and especially about Rust. Those seem to me to have big potential to change things. I see the kinds of frameworks that you've been covering, all of these little libraries and pieces and different approaches to putting content up. We keep oscillating between server side rendering and client side rendering in various forms. Um, but at the moment, this is weird. I feel like I should have some crystal ball moment, but I think things are actually sort of happily stable. JavaScript and CSS are evolving at a reasonable pace, and new things keep popping up, but nothing is seizing the crown.
I
That's one
think,
of the strange things. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Martin. Go ahead.
yeah, I think one of the important things here is what we're seeing is a shift from tooling being built to just make it possible to do things, to
Mhm.
tooling being built to make the things that we build faster. Because there used to be like a lot of the tooling that we've had built in the past decade and a half, things like jQuery and SAS and PostCSS and all of these different things were about how do we build the web platform to the level that it'll actually do what we want it to do, right? And all of the things that we have focused on, even in our courses, has been around how do you get the web platform to do what you want it to do, to look the way you want, to function the way you want. Now we actually have the tools and the platform to do almost all of those things, right? So then the question is, okay, now that it works, how do we make it work faster? So the shift to Rust, for example, is all about performance. It's all about making it faster. And you're starting to see this shift from like the front end of what people see, just getting it to work, and how do we get people to click on the right buttons, and how do we navigate people through an experience so they get where they want to go, to, okay, how do we make it function better for them, be more accessible to everyone across the planet, without taking the entire internet down because it's too big, things like that. So it's a shift in priorities and focus.
Yeah.
The interesting thing for me in having done this whole week is that I learned so much about some of these other, I want to call them platforms that have been doing well for quite a while. And seeing that there's a lot of work being done in Java. There's a lot of work being done in Go and Rust. I learned that, surprisingly enough for me, that Rust came out a year after Go, but in something to, I think, that Morten alluded to was the fact that Go had that backing from Google actually gave it a big push in the front. And we're seeing Rust kind of organically develop, from more of the community kind of making this thing. And what's really mattered, whether I talk to people from Java, whether I talk to people from Python, machine learning, what's really mattered is the community aspect, and the fact that what makes something last is the community around it. So I know that one of the things that you really talk about a lot, Morten, is this concept of privacy. It's really something that you're very passionate about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that on the web, where you think things can go, where, in talking about that, sometimes what gives things a really huge push is the fact that it's backed by some sort of huge company or maybe a huge country. Like, where does privacy fit in all those things, and how do we make sure that we're all in some ways still private, because it feels like nobody has any privacy anymore?
Yeah, privacy by design is the direction that we're headed right now, and mainly it's because of legislation in Europe, because the European Parliament and the EU Parliament just made a decision, or not just, but made decisions in the past several years to make the companies that manage our information responsible for ensuring that information is private, and that the end user, the populace, has power over their own information and can do whatever they want with it, in as far as they can say, I need to be able to control who has access to my information. I need to be able to take my information back from anyone. I need to be able to hold companies accountable if they leak my information to people who shouldn't have access to it, and so on. And when things happen in a large market like Europe, they tend to eventually spread out elsewhere. So even though, like, if you're an American company, you don't deal with the GDPR directly, but if you have a single European customer, even if that means a European who travels from Europe to America and uses your service, you have to care about GDPR because GDPR protects that person, right? So there's the shift in focus from the internet is this fun thing that we are just doing to the internet is actually this infrastructure thing that we all depend on and we need to act accordingly, is happening right now. And one of the big focus areas is privacy, because there's this constant tension between companies wanting to make money and using people's information to make that money because it's readily available to them, users taking advantage of the fact that the companies use that information to be able to use things like recommendation algorithms, right? If you are on a platform, the recommendation algorithm bases its decisions on your data and is able to direct you towards things that are beneficial to you, unless it has other ideas and wants to direct you towards things that are not good for you, right? And then you have the pressure between governments saying that everyone should be allowed to have free speech online and say whatever they want to, but free speech is not absolute, and we have to have restrictions on what people say because some speech can be harmful. And in some cases, people are using the internet to commit crimes, and we need to be able to track their behavior. And these things are all incompatible with each other, right? You can't have absolute free speech and free speech control. You can't have absolute availability of recommendation engines, but the recommendation engines don't have biases. You can't have governments saying, I'm going to stay out of your communication, but in some cases, I actually need to see all your communication, even the private communication. So there are a lot of pieces here that are incongruent. They don't fit, and we need to figure out how to make them fit and draw lines and say, like, these things are within the normal space and these things are safe, these things are unsafe. This is how we adjudicate when things are done correctly or incorrectly, and this is how we hold ourselves, our companies, and our governments accountable for decisions that are being made so that everyone is protected.
It's so tough to find that balance. I know, and I always talk to you about this, having come from totalitarian governments. I really think that from my point of view, it's always dangerous to sort of trust your government to do the right thing because I've been in places where that government hasn't done that. And so I'm always very nervous about trusting some government official with their own kind of desires to control things like privacy. So,
And I'm the exact opposite, right? I come up
yeah,
from an extremely high trust government where you actually had the government stepping in and protecting the populace against oppressive things, right? So
yes,
yes, this is part of the problem. We operate in a world that is multifaceted, where a solution that works in one country is going to be the worst possible solution in another country. Yet the internet is global
mm,
and the web is global. So how do you mediate that? Right?
yes,
These are problems we have not taken the time to think about carefully. We collectively need to talk about the future. We don't talk about the future anymore. We talk about right now. We need to
it's
talk about the
yeah.
future and what future we want.
I agree with you because and on top of that, you combine like company interests, the fact that so many companies are kind of owning things, and that's something that I wanted to ask Simon about. So one of the moves that we've seen recently is this move towards having companies hire the developers that pretty much own certain platforms. Like you saw this with Vercel, you've seen it, them hiring certain developers like Rich Harris, who created Svelte.js. I think Netlify hired, the guy who invented Solid.js. So you're seeing this really weird thing where companies that are acting, I think, in a solid interest, like they're trying to be nice about it, but they're hiring people that are controlling certain platforms. And I feel like there's a danger there that now, I work for a certain company, so it's not that I watch what I say sometimes, at least I think about what I say sometimes about certain companies because I am a human being. And I imagine that when you have somebody paying you a check to do whatever you want with open sourcing these products, that it has got to have some sort of impact. What are your take on that? What is your take on that, Simon, from like, I don't know, your broad perspective?
So yeah, I mean, I've worked in open source for 25 years, maybe more. I don't know. I do remember when I first started at LinkedIn, I would show up at web conferences with a LinkedIn T-shirt, and people would ask me if I was there to speak about Ember because it was well known at that point that LinkedIn was using Ember and bringing in the Ember team. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it. Um, some of it, I think, is kind of like that. Companies that really want to use a platform internally for their own projects want that kind of control and inside information and all of those things that make it easier to work with a framework or a platform. Um, it's not always that controlling, though. The thing that I've really enjoyed about open source in all this time is that there are incredible numbers of different models that companies and individuals have chosen to use to work with open source. I mean, I think most of what you hear about is licensing. Is this GPL? Is this BSD? That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That is part of it, but it's a very small part of it. Um, I have known developers who were basically paid by their employer to work on an open source project with no concern about how that directly benefited the company. I've talked with other people for whom it was not exactly sabotage, but definitely making sure that projects stayed within a particular range of things that were beneficial to their employer. You see that in standards organizations all the time as well.
Uh-huh.
Um, I I think this is kind of like what you were just saying with governments and how much we want to trust them. It varies wildly by the company and the project, and I try to keep a close eye on where things are going. And I think the best indicator usually is the community. I don't just mean like the core developer community, but the user community, the people proselytizing the technology. Who are they? Where are they coming from? If they're coming from more than one place, that's definitely a much better sign.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. I
There's
know. Yeah,
this
I know.
is
I was going to say I know Morton has some thoughts about this. He's probably itching to get
The
on this. So yeah,
rabid open source guy has something to say about this.
yes.
The problem here is that we have not yet figured out how to finance open source, right? Uh, Go read Richard Stallman's GNU manifesto and the cathedral and the bazaar, and look at how wrong they were about how the economy of open source was going to grow, because the kind of detached from reality ideals of open source when it was introduced in the 80s was that open source will win, and people will we will live in this utopia where people will just get paid for the work they do magically, and then corporations will lose all power. That's basically what it says. Like, if you go read the GNU manifesto, that's actually what it says. And the reality is quite opposite. That open source development is largely done by volunteers who are unpaid, who need to have a job. And that means that the number of people who are able to contribute to open source is very low. And those people tend to fall into very specific groups and socioeconomic spaces, right? There are people who have the time and the money and the capabilities of contributing their time freely. Then some companies come in and say, hey, so there are these infrastructure projects that exist in open source that someone has to fund. How on earth are we going to do this? Well, we can hire them. And then we can just put them in our company and have them work either full-time or part-time on an open source project. And within that comes this really difficult issue of, if you work for a company, you're kind of beholden to that company. And even if the company explicitly says you're not beholden to our ideas, it's very hard not to direct the project in a specific direction that benefits the company. And you can see that in a lot of open source projects where there is there are one or two large corporate entities that exist within the open source project that provide the majority of core development. And even though they say that they're not directing the project in directions that are beneficial to that company, anyone looking at it objectively will be like, no, that is simply untrue. And if you truly think that, you need to open your eyes, because you are truly just directing the open source project in directions that are beneficial to you. I like to say that in a lot of cases in open source, everyone talks about the cathedral and the bazaar, where the cathedral is the corporate entity and the bazaar is a place where everyone can play and everyone can do commerce and trade and work independently. And what's happened is a lot of big companies have built the cathedral inside the bazaar and made it look like the bazaar and retain exclusive rights to market the bazaar as the cathedral. So it's very complicated, and it boils down to the core ideological image and picture that the originators of open source ideology came from is detached from reality. It envisioned a world that never happened, and because they didn't build in the correct tooling to ensure that things were properly financed, there is no proper financing, and as a result, we have to lean on corporate interest. I'll just say this. Like, if you go read the GNU manifesto, he literally says corporations should pay a software tax, and that software tax should be given to open source developers through some mechanism, right? If you go to open source developers today or the corporate world today and say, hey, we should introduce a software tax to pay for open source, no one will be like, yay, that sounds like a great idea. But in reality, that's actually what we have to do.
Yeah, we definitely have to do something. I do think that Morton needs no caffeine. Just start talking to him about open source, and he gets riled up. But wait, there's more.
Point. Since this is focused on the thing we're doing with GitHub, GitHub is actually doing some of this work. GitHub announced at GitHub Universe 2 weeks ago now, last week, 2 weeks ago, that they are starting basically an open source fund. So you already have this capability within GitHub to say, if you have an open source project on GitHub, you can enable people to pay you for it through sponsorship. GitHub is now collecting money and then doling it out to projects that apply for it, that they deem to be significant enough that they need funding. And it's an effort specifically to fund diverse voices within open source to ensure that people are able to do the work that's necessary for us to move forward, so that some money gets funneled to users not based on a popularity contest or based on whether some corporate entity wants to deign to invest in it, but rather whether or not a project actually has value to the world. So, work is being done. It's just slow and cumbersome.
And I'm perversely enjoying that GitHub is part of Microsoft. And 20 years ago, this would have completely freaked out everyone in the open source world. But
I
yes.
feel like it still does. I feel like it still does.
Very
All
much
right.
so.
So Simon, let's talk a little bit about the state of not the frameworks, but just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There used to be a time, and it was great covering the history of frameworks, where it took like 10 years for a new version of JavaScript to come out, right? And now it's pretty much on an annual schedule that you get a new version. CSS is going nuts right now, still to this day, just exploding in creativity. Although you've seen a slowdown in some of the maybe frameworks, the stabilization of everything into React. What's your take on just the core language? Are we going to see a slowdown, or are you going to see just a continuing growth of some of these, different languages?
Well, I'm kind of echoing what Morten just said about we're getting the things that we needed to get things done. And once we've done that, things will probably pause a little bit. JavaScript is, it got a giant burst in 2015 with the ES6 changes. People still call it ES6. The changes have been much slower and steadier since then, and I think that's been happier all around for people. The fact that we have build tools has made it a lot easier to absorb changes in JavaScript. Babel was kind of a classic piece for making it possible to use new versions of things without breaking old browsers. So I feel pretty good about JavaScript's continuing evolution. CSS is on fire in good ways, although it does there are some people who are still like, give me back my floats. This Flexbox and grid stuff is new and therefore confusing. I'm delighted to put away my floats and just shift to a world of Flexbox and grid and these other new pieces. Look up CSS clamp if you want some interesting ways to stretch your brain about how to calculate things on a screen. The one that I'm sad about is HTML. I feel like HTML5 15 years ago basically said that all future development of HTML would be a side effect of JavaScript work. And I think that was a mistake. There's a lot of stuff that we could share in HTML if anybody actually reopened that. But at this point, I don't see any political will to do it. The W3C has basically shut down that conversation on their side. The WhatWG is not very eager to do anything there. So I was hoping that we would have like this storm of new web components and figuring out cool new things, and then we would use that to standardize ideas back into the core markup language, and very little of that has happened. So on the bright side, it means that the HTML you learned 10 years ago is still the HTML you can use today. That part's great. And my cat has very strong opinions about these things, apparently, and keeps jumping up. So, yes.
Yeah, so I think like I think I've mentioned to you that I think CSS should be slowed down a little bit. I mean, I think it's fine right now. I agree with you in HTML. I do think that I saw that there's like a dialogue tag like maybe coming out. That's actually a great use of HTML, and we should see more of that. But you said other than that, I haven't really seen a lot of new things. I think CSS is dangerously close to becoming a programming language in a way. I don't know what Morten's thoughts are about this.
Oh, Morten has thoughts.
Oh, I'm sure Morten's
first of all, Miriam Suzanne, who's a invited expert in the CSS working group, posted this amazing article earlier this week that's called "When Our Tools Hold Us Back," which says a lot of the things that I've been thinking for a very long time about how the tools we use tend to be very conservative in terms of they do things the old way. And one of her examples is just saying, look at like, why are people using hex colors? It makes no sense. Hex colors are not the best way of communicating colors. We have much better ways of communicating colors, including HESLA, right? That are actually human understandable, yet somehow we always divert back to this incomprehensible hex system because that's how it's always been done. And the tools we use enforce that. right? And it's the same with like when you're making grid layouts. If you use site builders, they always revert back to Flexbox based grids, which is not how to do it correctly. You have grid for a reason, and there's this disconnect between the tools we use and the platform, that the tools lag really far behind and the tools are actually holding the platform back. So like I'm on the other end of the spectrum from Ray in this. I think that what we're seeing in CSS now and the evolution of CSS now is that CSS is finally capable of doing the things that we've been hacking our way into until now. A lot of what the three of us, learned about CSS is now wrong, because the things that we used to do were actual hacks to get things to work. And now we have the tools to get them to work properly, but we've been so indoctrinated in the way of hacking this that we don't see the tools for what they are. The funny part about the HTML thing is, I think the reason why HTML develops slowly is because HTML needs to be robust. And Jeremy Keith wrote about this in Resilient Web Design many, many years ago, that the premise of HTML is that it cannot break. Even if you only get served the core HTML markup and you're looking at the actual code and you don't understand code, you should be able to comprehend what is happening in the document. And that means any evolution of HTML needs to consider, what if someone is just looking at this code? Or what if you're loading this code in a browser that's really old? What happens? How do you ensure that it doesn't break in the process? And that's the design premise for all HTML. So HTML is the robust underlying layer that cannot break and is designed as a declarative language, rather, so that it is just declaring things. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is that it just doesn't render correctly. And that means any inclusion into HTML needs to consider those constraints before something happens. Whereas CSS is a declarative language that sits on top that just adds style. So you can take it out, it doesn't change the meaning of the content. And JavaScript is the first, what is it called?
Is it layer?
It's not called
maybe?
declarative, it's called the other end. Like, no, it's the first language that does something, right? Where if you make a mistake in JavaScript, all hell breaks loose. It all explodes, right? Because it's an imperative language, right? Imperative. Right. So it does things.
Unfortunately, we responded to those constraints in HTML by filling the world with divs and spans, which themselves
but that's because
make it useless.
That is because of the tooling and because of how we have been. Our community has gotten used to being very regressive in how it implements things.
Our community gets
like
failed. Yes.
Yeah, and like the tooling that gives us these endless div trains, right? Where like I often go into projects and I say, you have like 16 layers of divs here. All you need is a main. That's it. Like all of these divs are unnecessary. They were just introduced to make some sort of layout thing. But if you use grid, you can get rid of all of it, right? And it's because that, as Miriam says in the article, no one has built a proper site building tool that actually uses the layout components we have now. Because no one is thinking like that.
Yeah, don't look at the Wix code. Don't look at it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like my problem, that the writing of CSS it feels like it's about to be handed off to some sort of machine that's going to have to do it, because it's going to get just too complicated for humans. And so this is the problem that I have when I run into something like this. This is the new color format. Being given a very friendly name of OKLCH. And I know that it makes sense. I know that it makes a lot of sense, but why? Why? I mean, the reason is because it probably makes perfect sense to go through the letters and what they actually do, but it's just not human friendly, my friend. Yes.
My brother in Christ. Don't pretend for a second that you can cough up the hex code for any random color.
But at least I know what it's doing, and I know hex well enough. Yeah.
You know that mathematically what it's doing, but you don't know what it produces. While I agree with you,
you're right, because it is RGB.
So I agree with you that whatever that thing is a terribly named thing. I don't understand why they didn't just go HSL works fine. Hue, saturation, lightness.
That would make sense.
Clear, right? And this is actually just this is like HSL backwards, right? You have the color at the end, I think, the degrees, and then you have the center, like the percentage is the lightness, and then yeah, so it's the same. It's just under a new name for some reason. But this is actually human understandable, whereas hex is not. And RGB is a color format specifically for projection screens, which is not how anyone thinks about anything, right? How do you get yellow out of red, green, and blue? That is
Yeah.
something
Well,
only a screen can figure out.
well, it's
Of course,
also how the eyes work. Like, that's like human eyes perceive color with like the three different cones that make up those colors. So,
I still use the CSS named colors periodically, so
which
go
is a
back to the
great
Crayola
idea.
box.
But that's what I mean. That I think that it to me when I saw this color format, first of all, I played with it and I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. This is actually great because what it does for me is it allows you to easily go, this is the color. Now, do I want it to be a shade, or do I want it to be like a little bit lighter or darker? It's like you said, it's like HSL, but it's a little bit better because it does let you
Yeah.
go base color and then go lighter or darker and create like a shade if you want to, and it makes a lot of sense. But I just think that the math, I don't know what it is about. Definitely the name could use a little bit better marketing, I guess. But
Oh,
this is, yeah, I know, this is why I feel like you sometimes you need to rein in the engineers, the purists and the engineers, and remember that at least for right now, that a lot of these things are written by people, and I just don't see people going, you know, whatever the heck that is. Somebody should make a word out of it. It's like impossible also to make a word out of it. All right, before we get too far, let's see what else we have here. So, okay, we have seen things that have failed the web, Morten. For example, Flash, maybe web components. I don't know. Do you feel like web components have failed? We have languages like CoffeeScript and Angular. CoffeeScript, I think, succeeded in a way. Angular succeeded, then Google failed it, and then it came back as something else. We have Quick right now, which is actually from the gentleman that invented Angular 1. So what did we learn, and what can we learn from those kind of successes and failure, more, and that we don't do again?
I think none of those things failed. They are building blocks on the staircase that we call web development, and they, a lot of those things were instrumental in building the web we have today, and then we learned from them, and then we built the things into our tools. Right? You can see CoffeeScript and Mustache and all those things are the precursors to React, right? So it's very much, they are literally stones in a staircase, and we've just moved past, like we put them down and then we stepped on top of them and built something else, and then we put them down and step on top of them. It's the same with Flash. I remember when Flash got removed from Apple, a bunch of Apple people were like, yay, finally Flash was removed, ignoring the history of what Flash did. And also the fact that Flash was never meant to be a web platform at all. It was never meant to be for animation. And there are tons of people who make movies that go into theaters right now that are made from Flash. So Flash isn't dead at all. It's just going back to its origin purpose. What we can learn from the wars between competing frameworks like Angular and React, for example, is that there is going to be a lot of competition within these frameworks, and some of that competition can be really harmful, because if you invest all your time and energy into a framework and it falls apart, then you need, if you didn't learn the basics, you are then stuck. So what I'm seeing now, and what I've seen for the last several years, is that a lot of new entrants into the web space tend to start by learning a framework instead of learning the base language. So they start by learning, for example, React, because that's where the jobs are, but they don't learn JavaScript. And that means if you then want to move to a job that doesn't use React, you suddenly don't know how to do things. But if you learn JavaScript and then build your skills on top to also learn React, you'll be able to go down again to their base layer and say, okay, what are the new things I need to learn to use this other framework? Marrying yourself to a framework is always a risky endeavor because they will change. Learning the base languages, learning the base premises allows you to use whatever tool comes next.
So, Simon, I'll pose pretty much the same question to you, but I do want to say a couple of things about what Morten said. And I think that these things, even though they still exist and they're alive and they changed things, there's a way in which they failed because we don't use CoffeeScript anymore. There was something that Google saw about Angular that they didn't like. Web components was seemed like a fantastic idea, and it just never took. Those are what I'm talking about in terms of failure. There's something about them that didn't quite take. So what can we learn from those things?
Yeah, Simon,
So,
Yeah,
I
why
mean, I
did
think
web components
please
fail?
advise us. Yes.
so. I'll start with CoffeeScript. I mean, there isn't really a large active CoffeeScript community today, but it succeeded completely as a provocation. It was a wonderful thing to have as conference talks to demonstrate, like, look, we can do these things so much more easily. And I think the rest of the web picked that up and sort of absorbed those ideas, if not CoffeeScript itself, into the community. Um, Web components, I it's harder. Web components, I think, was a great idea. I think it was the natural next step after the HTML5 work and all of these APIs and the revival of JavaScript in a way. But it got bogged down in standards battles. It got stuck in weird wars over the best way to reveal information. The web has never really had a clean sense of containers. A page is a page, and that's the container, and sort of everything within it historically has been visible. So I think it kind of broke people's expectations. Um, I still have hope that something like web components will come around again. It will probably build on some of the pieces of web components that actually do get used. But at this point, yeah, I can't say that it succeeded. Whether its provocations help us out in the future, I hope so, but I don't know.
I I
Very true.
think I think web components, if it was introduced now instead of 10 years ago, would actually succeed because the like web components introduced shadow DOM. It introduced like component based loading. The problem was we didn't have things like modules in JavaScript yet, right? And we relied on all these external libraries like Polymer. And then React came along and was like, hey, this component idea is good. We're just going to package it all into this framework. And then React became the standard, and React is incompatible with web components. So, or it's very hard to get React to work with web components. So all the attention got shuffled off to React. But what we're seeing now is that a lot of the underpinning functionality that's needed for web components to work properly is being introduced on the web platform. And that means I honestly think that web components are going to have a resurgence if someone takes the time to reframe the message and explain to people that you can do what you can do in React, you can now just do on the web platform if you use web components and these new tools.
I
Hmm.
sort of hope for an equivalent of like what jQuery did for Ajax for something else to do for web components in a current context. I don't think Polymer
Mhm.
is that jQuery, but I
Yeah.
haven't seen anyone really pick up that torch and run with it.
I think that in essence, we all have web components because in the way that Morton said that JavaScript can now do modules, React is pretty much what web I think perhaps what killed web components was something that was so much better and quicker and easier to use. I mean, I think that maybe that's what killed it. Like it was just difficult to get web components working in the way that you wanted them to work, but that modularity concept, that ability to create, essentially a component. It's really a part of every single framework. It's a core sort of part of every framework now. So although it may have failed, and there's a framework called Lit that Google's trying to get started to get those things rebooted. I think it's already won, and it might be too late to like bring it back in its original form. Also, I think that it's important, and I don't know. I think Morton may disagree with me on this. I think it's important to keep JavaScript pure and let some of these other things run away with experimentations until they solidify and they can maybe be brought back into core, or maybe they don't need to be brought back into core. Like we saw the module sort of structure to really get adopted, into JavaScript. We saw like, the fetch API and asynchronicity, just the synchronous JavaScript, like sort of grow out of sort of the needs of things to change, but it just be very careful about what you add. I saw like a new sort of attempt to bring some things back into like core JavaScript that, sometimes I'm like, maybe just keep it like it's fine if it's smaller and we don't make it like, products. I'm not going to mention any, but products that have too many features at some point are supposed to be simple, right? All right, with that, I think we're almost out of time. So before we get going, let's do something fun. We'll get into the random access. I know everybody that I've had on random access has been super nervous about this. So these are a set of questions that neither Morten nor Simon have ever heard before, although I do let them know about the topics that we'll be covering. This isn't completely something they don't know about, so they're going to be shocked. And I'm sure in Morton's case, very animated about some of these things that I'll present today. Because that's just like Morton's standard, like just animated about things. So, all right, let's get going. You guys ready?
Go for it.
All right, let's go for question one. All right, so question one. In the supernatural sci-fi thriller R.I.P.D., Jeff Bridges and Ryan Reynolds play a couple of law agents who find and capture those who have escaped judgment. If you were able to bring back one of these internet properties, which one would it be? And the options here I'm putting together are Google Plus, AOL, and I know AOL is still around by, I don't know who you, besides maybe, I think Simon goes in every now and then, and I don't know what he does on AOL, but Friendster, Vine, MySpace, and something I hadn't heard about until I did the research called Yik Yak, which I hear it's really big at. Was valued at $400 million at some point. So I think Morton remembers it. So what will you save? What will you bring back?
Are we bringing these back for punishment, or are we bringing them back?
Like you would say, I think AOL did this thing wrong. I figured if we were able to sort of bring it back, it's a good brand, and I could revive it by making it more relevant today. So what would do you like any of these? Have you, besides AOL, were you on any of these, Simon?
I was on Google Plus, and I
Briefly?
visited a lot of MySpace stuff, though I didn't have a MySpace set up. The only one that I really have warm, fuzzy feelings for at all is MySpace. And that's mostly
it's so weird that thing died because it was so dominant, right? And then what it did wrong is like let people design their own thing is what I thought killed it. Like, man, like you went to some of these sites and they were just unviewable. They were just so garbage.
The dancing babies.
Is that where it came from?
It took an hour to load because there were so many of them.
Well, now you're making me miss Tripod, but...
Oh, what? I don't even know that one. All right, Morton, what would you bring back? Pick one.
Okay, I have to go with my TikTok audience here and say Vine.
Vine,
Vine was basically TikTok without the harms of TikTok. It's never going to happen, but like that would be the one that I would bring up.
I think Elon's talking about maybe bringing him back, so that would be interesting.
That man touches will just burn.
All right, I'm going to say that I would bring back Google Plus. Like Google, it's so dominant. I mean, it has YouTube, but it doesn't really have like a social platform, and it just felt like they somehow should have figured it out. But it's maybe the fact that it was Google that killed it. To this day, people always still say like plus one this, and I guess most people don't know what they're talking about, but maybe that's the one that I would bring back. All right, that's great. All right, second question. Morton once described this book and movie called Ready Player One about a future immersive web based on 80s media properties as something that was made for Ray, me, and also other people. In the future, which company do you feel like is going to own the immersive web? Is it going to be current contender Meta, who's really poured so much money that they have to fire a bunch of people because they apparently killed a big piece of it? Google, is Google going to be dominant there? Apple, ByteDance, who is, I believe, the parent company of TikTok, or is it going to be someone else? What do you say? We'll start with Morton this time because I asked Simon.
ByteDance.
You think for sure?
Doing it. Yeah, 100%. Meta has astonishingly failed at this, just to the point where it's going to go down because of it. Google is too fragmented in their own mind to be able to do this, Apple will make like a little bespoke mid-century modern custom experience for 8 people who will claim that this is where everyone is. Meanwhile, TikTok will be like in the stratosphere doing unbelievable things. Meanwhile, collecting all our data and programming our brains with their implants. So yeah,
So hold on.
ByteDance for
ByteDance
sure.
has an immersive experience. Like, are you talking about like a 3D kind of like world sort of thing?
TikTok is that already.
Oh,
The
well, it's
the
kind
only
of, I
thing
thought,
they need is just to put TikTok in some sort of AR environment. It's already there. I mean, people like they do the live thing already. People literally live stream their lives bite-sized on that platform. They're already
interesting.
there. All they need is just the interface, and then they're done.
All right. I can hardly.
It'll be harmful. It's the worst company to do it, but they're the ones that are going to do it.
All right. So I feel like it's really difficult to tell how Morton feels about things. So what do you think, Simon? What do you think is going to happen? You being a more reserved kind of analytical person, what would you say?
I think it's going to be someone else. I
Hmm.
think all of these companies have too much baggage from the way that they've already succeeded. I loved your description of the bespoke mid-century modern version. I just Meta learned so much from Facebook and WhatsApp that I just can't imagine them breaking out of those models in a really wild new way. Google might do it for a minute and a half and then kills the
Yeah.
project. Uh,
The second it's
ByteDance,
successful, yeah, pull the plug on
ByteDance
that thing.
definitely has immersive down, like people just stay on the app and bounce around within it really happily. But I think they're going to get stuck in geopolitical everything. It's not just that they're terrible, it's that they're Chinese. And right now, that seems to be not something that's acceptable to the US government. So I think that's going to fragment in some ways. My long term guess is that someone else picks up this baton, and as Google, Meta, and friends kind of fade, somebody figures it out in a different way. Nobody thought TikTok would emerge at the time it did. It didn't seem like something new, and it just got it right enough in a different way. And
Hmm.
I think we'll see something similar here.
I agree. I agree with you. I think that someone else is probably more likely. I think Apple will do something. Occasionally, they're good at like sort of steering the industry in a certain way, like just by coming out with whatever they come out. All the computers look the same, like, and they're all Apples now. They're all like silver. Like they're good at doing something that shifts the direction, but ultimately, in the same way that TikTok figured out immersiveness in a way, I think that once you figure out your niche, you have too much baggage to sort of take that into the future. All right, last question. This would be the Super Bowl has been famous for internet properties that are no longer around, like pets.com, Flow TV, Just for Feet. 10 years from now, which one of these companies in the last Super Bowl, in Super Bowl 2021, will no longer exist? All right,
I see you took
Simon.
out FTX.
Was that one? Oh, did they? Oh, I didn't know.
They did.
Were they
They already
on?
kind of don't
My
exist.
research
So.
did not turn up. Yeah, turn that up. But yes. What do you think, Simon? In 10 years, which one of these is still around? There's an obvious one here, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, there are lots of good choices here.
Yeah.
I think though I'm going to pick on Uber. I
Hmm.
don't know that their business model is sustainable at all, and the Eats thing seems to push it even further. Um, the one I think, well, the two that I think will be around are Squarespace and probably Amazon. Squarespace might get acquired or transform. Amazon may just be cloud services at some point. Who knows? But I think in some way they'll be here. Oh, there we go. We added it.
Fixed it.
Well,
All
FTX is
right.
already dead. So.
Yes, that
Uh,
does technically doesn't count. What do you think, Morton?
Fiverr
Fiverr,
will
huh?
not exist.
Interesting. Yeah, it's got some sort of audience, but it's never really developed.
It's
I think Indeed is trying to solve something that it's kind of like got a lot of. It's not different enough or unique enough, although they've made a lot of inroads. Probably maybe get acquired by something else. I'm with Simon too about Uber Eats. I think they're trying to break into a market that's already got like a lot of things in it, and it's difficult to differentiate yourself. And they're not necessarily the leader. Their model is full of, government regulation type issues. So That's that. All right. So we do have some really good comments in the chat. So I wanted to say, let's go to this Q&A section really quick. Sorry. So people are saying this is a great episode, even for a non-web guy who has only dabbled in stuff. Helps understanding things. Thanks, Ray, and everyone else. After Clearinghouse, Meta is going to is going to take it. Somebody's saying Fiverr got a huge audience here in Pakistan. That's great. I didn't know that. It does have a big audience. I think audience is not their problem. It's sort of like breaking through. So there's
The
a few
problem is
other.
the business model.
Hmm.
Someone else will do it and not like someone will do this at a higher level where it's not considered to be cheap and crappy, and then that will take off.
Okay, there's some other questions in the chat that I know that if I ask them, Warren's going to go for like another 30 minutes. So we better move on. And you can check them out a little bit later. So let's see. Let's check out. So one of the things that's happened is we have had a 50 plus courses released in Codespaces that we're really excited about. So these courses were actually created in Codespaces for Codespaces for the launch, so that people can get the coding as quickly as possible. And I wanted to get Morton's thoughts on his experience making a lot of courses in Codespaces. I know you have some thoughts about this, Morton.
It's rare that we often say that term, this changes everything. And it's kind of, it doesn't really, it just gives you a new way of slicing bread. Codespaces actually does change everything, especially around education, because it lowers the barrier to accessing learning to code to the point where anyone with a keyboard-enabled device and a web browser and an internet connection can be dropped right into a professional enterprise coding environment where they need to be to start learning to code. You don't need to do any setup. You don't need to do any configuration. All of that can be prepared in advance. It really is going to change both how we learn to code, how we do onboarding processes in companies, and how people just do their regular work. It is quite literally moving the development process into the cloud, into an integrated environment where you can create custom containers to contain whatever project you have that is custom built for that particular project that anyone can spin up from anywhere in the world on their own computer. So I'm actually doing a talk on this at an event apart in San Francisco next month. So if you happen to be in San Francisco, come meet me and chat about it.
That's fantastic. I'm going to say that, as everyone knows, especially Simon, Morton and I don't always agree on everything, but this is one place where I 100% agree on everything he just said and more. It does change everything. I think that for me, what really drove it in is the fact that we gave this to 30 developers who can't even agree on tabs versus spaces, and everybody loved it. I was expecting people to, since we were maintaining like sort of the project in the back end, I expected I'm going to send this to 30 people and I'm going to get like about 200 emails on why it's not going to work. And it was crickets. And that to me was the best sort of, I don't know, signal that said that, okay, this is fantastic. So I do want to definitely let you check out the San Francisco talk that Morton is going to be doing with a bunch of other fantastic people. So go check that out.
Look at that lineup.
Look at that,
guy in the corner. But the rest of that lineup. See, Miriam is there.
Yeah, Marian is there.
Controlling the cascade.
Yeah, Marian is a genius. You really should go listen to any talk that she puts on. She's amazing. And, there's a lot of other LinkedIn Learning staff author here, Val Head, and these are always fantastic. I've loved Chris is going to be there, of course. So definitely check that out. Other than that, you can also check out GitHub Universe. The website still has a ton of really good information. And as I've been mentioning all week, my favorite is always to see like the 10 years of GitHub. It kind of gives you great perspective. Thank you so much, both of you all. I'm so happy that I ended the week with some people that are truly my friends and that I really enjoy spending time with. We spend so much time together and it's never enough. So thank you so much. And I'm really happy to have done this. And I want to thank all of y'all for being here. And who knows, maybe this will continue in some other way. We'll talk to everyone later.